And thanks to everybody for joining us this morning. We're in for a real treat. Absolutely delighted to have with us Matias Spektor, who's a great friend, a personal friend, and also a great friend of the Inter-American Dialogue. And want to thank Matias for taking time out of his busy schedule this week in Washington to join us and to share some thoughts. Matias is an associate professor and directs the International Relations Center for International Relations at the Getulio Vargas Foundation in Brazil, which is the country's leading think tank. He's also a columnist for Folha de São Paulo, author of many books, among them Kissinger in Brazil, I guess was his first book, and then a book on 18 days, which was talked about President Lula and Cardoso trying to win over President Bush at that time in 2002. And he's had other books as well. I won't mention all of them. Matias has a doctorate in international relations from Oxford. He's a widely respected scholar, analyst, commentator, very influential in Brazil and elsewhere. So we're delighted to have him this morning. He's to talk about understanding Brazil's protracted crisis. He's going to come back in a couple of weeks and talk about understanding the United States' protracted crisis. But we thought we'd start with Brazil this morning. And I thought I'd just ask a few questions, and then it'd open up to all of you for a good discussion and comments. And I thought maybe I would just start, Matias. This is a very well-informed group. We read the, New York Times and Washington Post and the Folha de São Paulo. And your columns, and we know about the tremendous political crisis in the country, the discontent with the political class, the corruption scandals and the like, the economy, which has been struggling, maybe gotten a little bit better in the last months, but basically has been very, very difficult. And I'm wondering if you could just put this, I think it would be very useful just to maybe put this in historical perspective. You love history. Other moments in Brazil that have also been difficult. Military coup, the suicide of Getulio Vargas. What is distinctive in particular about this moment from your perspective and other moments in the past? What distinguishes this moment?
Excellent. Thanks ever so much. It's a real treat to be here. So what's distinctive about Brazil now? If you think about it, Brazil is now a democracy. It's pretty consolidated as a democracy. We've had free competitive elections since 1985. We've had universal suffrage since the illiterate got the vote in 1989. We've had governments of the center-right and the center-left. The military are in the barracks. Democratic Brazil managed to establish a South American system that worked for Brazil for a long time. For 30 years it worked until Lava Jato. So on the face of it, there's no problem. And if you look at the way people comment about it, Brazilian democracy is strong and stable. When Lula came to power, the White House reaction was to say, everything's okay, Brazil is a vibrant, multi-ethnic democracy. It's a good model for South America and perhaps Latin America. Well, in the last 4 years, that consensus has been cracked. Brazilian democracy, which is very much there, all these things I mentioned are there, coexists with stuff that is undermining democracy in very fundamental ways. And I think the interesting thing from the standpoint of the Inter-American Dialogue is that these things are not exclusive to Brazil. We now see these things across South America. So 30 years after the wave of democratization, we look at this and we realize a few things. So a few things on Brazil. First of all, the system of checks and balances, which is essential on James Madison's formulation to the working of democracy, are not operating in Brazil. And that's to do with the Brazilian brand of coalitional presidentialism. And we can talk about it in a minute. Rent-seeking is pervasive in society, which means that corruption is not the exception, but the rule. The Brazilian political system, as it operates, the brand of coalitional presidentialism as it exists, cannot do without opportunities for rent-seeking and corruption. Corruption is endemic to this model, is not exceptional. So the issue with Lava Jato is that the more we advance in what we know, the more we realize that the edifice of democratic stability in the last 30 years rests on clay feet. I'll give you that as history.
Okay. And take us to the current moment now. In other words, to what extent there obviously has been the role of the judiciary, the prosecutors, and so forth has been, I think, something that a lot of people have admired by the vigor. Is this a turning point? Okay. In other words, is this okay? Clay feet, okay, enough of that. We're really going to build a much more real democratic, stable foundation to our politics, or is this simply going to, maybe if the economy gets better and sort of, things start to kick in, well, we'll forget about that and we'll just manage and keep going along as we have been over the last 30 years.
So I think yes and no. One of the things Lava Jato has unveiled, and we did not know this, no expert in Brazil, no one in Brazil knew the extent to which the judiciary system is subject to political pressure. We now know, thanks to plea bargain agreements, thanks to legal and illegal recordings of conversations between top-notch politicians and judges, we now know that in the Supreme Court and everywhere else in the Brazilian judicial system, political power takes you a long, long way. Of course, we should have known better. Never in the history of Brazilian democracy, not once, a candidate for the Supreme Court presented by the president was turned down by the Senate. Not once. We also knew that Brazilian presidents appoint to the Supreme Court and the other key institutions within the judiciary their mates, their friends, their lawyers, their personal lawyers. But we now know, and this we didn't know even 6 months ago, that the auditing court that is in charge of checking the executive by looking at the accounts is mired in corruption scandals itself. We didn't know that the Supreme Electoral Court, which is in charge of looking after campaign finance, it's fictional. Its pieces are fictional. They will take whatever political parties give them and accept. So, to a large degree, the core institution that should be the watchdog against the presidential powers and the legislative powers is not operational. So there's an issue with checks and balances. If that's the case, then how do we explain Lava Jato? And the answer is, Lava Jato is the product of a very small, under the age of 50, they were all of them wrote their master's dissertation on the Italian scandal. 3 of them, and what Manipuliti did was use the prisoner dilemmas model to try and get people suspected of corruption to speak up and to denounce others in exchange for a reduction of their penas in prison. That group is exceptional. It's not the norm. And that group is now coming under enormous fire because, of course, we now have these very persistent but also perverse coalition between the executive and the legislative and parts of the judiciary banding together against Lava Jato and trying to curtail its influence. They will not be able to get rid of it because Lava Jato commands enormous popular support. It is by far the most popular institution operating in Brazil now, more than the military, more than the police force. So the political class will not be able to get rid of it, but it's certainly trying hard to fight back. And crucially, if this interpretation is correct, we can now tell a new story about why Dilma fell. If this story is correct, the reason why Dilma fell was because she could not provide a shield against Lava Jato. She was too weak to operate the system in a way that the prosecutors, that the Office of the National Prosecutor in particular, that the federal police, which has enormous investigative powers in Brazil now, would be in check. How has Temer done? He's done remarkably well. And there's one phenomenal recording, legal recording, of a senator very close to President Temer, Senator Romero Jucá, who says, we need to get rid of Dilma now because someone has to stop the bleeding. And we will do it with everyone. We'll do it with the Senate. We'll do it with the Supreme Court. We can deliver the Supreme Court. That has worked. So President Temer now has approval rates below the inflation rate. Temer has 3% approval rates. And among people under the age of 24, which is the majority of the Brazilian people, he's got 0%. I've never seen a poll showing 0% support for anyone. So can Temer survive? Yes. On what premise? On the premise that he shows the system that he's the chief operator to keep Lava Jato in its place.
Mm-hmm. But he's that low, but he's actually done some things, hasn't he? I mean, if you leave aside the corruption question, he's actually accomplished some things.
Yes.
Got some things done, right?
He's accomplished enormous things, and one should take the hat off for that, right? So when Temer comes to power, the theory that commands his group is this. The reason Dilma's fallen is because she cannot provide security for the political class, but also because we are under a massive recession, and for the first time in 30 years, the lower middle classes are losing purchase power. And this is going to make the whole system unravel. So we need to provide some modicum of economic growth. And these guys came up with a pretty decent plan. They got together with the best economists in the country. They put together an actual written plan called the Bridge to the Future. And they have implemented the Bridge to the Future. And the political classes voted against their own interests time and again since Temer's been in power, almost 2 years, trying to get, very fundamental basic reforms in an economy that remains relatively closed. Brazil is the most closed economy to international trade in the whole of the G20. Reducing the red tape, which is pervasive across Brazilian economic activities in all sectors. Privatizing the large chunks of state companies that remained in the hands of the state to this day. So he's accomplished all of that, and that is very remarkable, and that also helps explain, of course, why he remains there, even if he's only got 3%.
Okay. Thanks. So we're looking at a critical election a year from now. Brazil is coming up. There are other elections in Latin America. And I think in general there's a lot of uncertainty, but Brazil seems particularly wide open and uncertain. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you see kind of the mood and what people are looking for. João gave an excellent presentation last month, and I think he said this is not a matter of right or left. Ideology is really but it's really old and new. And if that's your sense as well, what is the new? What is the demand? And what's the offer? What's the supply out there for this election?
Okay, great. So this is how I see the picture. As of now, it's the politics of anger that is the defining mood in Brazil. Anger against the political class, not unlike what you saw in this country in the last election. And that means even politicians who poll relatively well, and that's the case for Lula in all scenarios where he runs, he commands anything between 20 to 30% of the vote, the rejection rates are enormous. And it applies to Lula, and it applies to Alckmin on the right, it applies to Doria on the right, it applies to Bolsonaro on the far right, and we don't have far left-wing candidates that are competitive enough. But if we had one, probably they would command enormous rejection as well. Mm-hmm. So my personal sense is that we may not know, we may not have heard of the next president of Brazil. The field is wide open for new people to come in. And of course, these can attract people from the entertainment world, because the entertainment world has one advantage. People who come from it don't have to campaign for 2 years to get their face recognized. Name recognition is immediate. Followership on Facebook, on Twitter will be enormous. Brazilians, according to Facebook, Brazilians are the second nation online after the United States on Facebook platforms, on Google, and the rest, Instagram and what have you. And if you look at the way the political debate is evolving, the most interesting thing to me personally is how all candidates now replicate their struggle in the social media world, and how that is very likely to be defining of the election, given that the vast majority of the Brazilian electorate is online because it's very young. That said, I agree with Jean. I don't think it's going to be right and left. I think there's going to be enormous demand for someone who can be strong on security. Security issues will be crucial, and that's why it's very likely, do I want to say very likely? It is likely that we will find the most competitive candidates to be on the center-right, unless the left can get together and come up with a narrative that shows that they will tackle security. You know, Brazil last year had 60,000 homicides by fire weapon. This means that when you look at fire weapons, Brazil is more violent today than Iraq, Afghanistan, or even Syria on fire weapons. 60,000 is absolutely shocking. There's no major city, needn't be a capital city, even in the interior of Brazil, there's no city above 200,000 people where people feel safe. It's a scourge, and this is, of course, a magnet that attracts enormous popular support, and that's why you can have a neo-fascist candidate like Bolsonaro promising outrageous things, command 10 to 12% of the vote intention, and actually command the social media space. So I think we're going to find some of that. And then, of course, someone who can promise some modicum of economic stability and growth. That said, because the economy is now recovering, I think it's plausible that in the next year, as consumption goes up, and everything suggests that consumption is going to go up in the next 12 months, that the center, that what center-right, what Temer represents now, will gain not popularity, but credibility in terms of a vision for the future of the Brazilian economy. So a candidate from the entertainment world that manages to talk the tough language of security, plus defend the economic legacies of these last 2 years, I think that person would be pretty unbeatable if Lula doesn't run.
Okay. So the economy, so in other words, a candidate who promises continuity with the trajectory of the way things are going would be in a strong position.
With the trajectory of economic policy.
Economic policy.
Not a candidate whose continuity to Temer will not gain support. Right. Temer is the most unpopular.
Right.
Right?
Right, okay. Do you have The Apprentice in Brazil?
Yes.
Okay, you do.
We do have The Apprentice, and in fact, the guy who ran The Apprentice in Brazil considered running for president.
Ah, okay. Oh, that will never
We have
happen.
many others.
That will never. That's impossible. That's impossible. Yeah. We have a lot of people going to ask questions. And hands are already up, and people are on the edge of their seats. But let me ask one final question before we open it up to. And this is the issue of Venezuela, and in two senses, if you can address both of them. One is I'm struck by, and I'm surprised, frankly, by the degree to which Venezuela is playing out both in the other two important elections in 2018, which Mexico and Colombia. It's an issue in both of those elections. You know, this is going to be another Venezuela. We're going to be another Venezuela. And it's being used politically in both campaigns. My sense is that is not, that's not out there in Brazil, but maybe you can comment on that. And the second is simply, Brazil's role in dealing with the Venezuela crisis, which is a separate issue. And President Temer was in New York for the UNGA meetings and had dinner with Trump and some other presidents from Latin America, Santos, Varela. And what is the sense, of Brazil's possible role in positioning, the level of concern, the options that are being considered, the debate? Can you give us a little bit of sense of that?
So first of all, I don't think the Venezuela issue is going to play out in the Brazilian election at all. concern for Venezuela is minimal in Brazil. It concentrates very narrowly in one section of the political class, which is the PT, which, because of Lava Jato, is now, rather than being sorry and asking the electorate for forgiveness, is insisting on defending the choices that were made. And that includes, within that package, there is a very strong defense of Maduro. So Celso Amorim, the former foreign minister, went out in public the other day to say Venezuela is a vibrant democracy.
Amorim said that?
Yes. We've had similar utterances coming from Lula and from all of that group. But other than that, I don't think it plays out in any way. The second thing to say is that Brazil doesn't do democracy promotion. It never did, with one exception, Paraguay in 1996. Other than that, Brazil doesn't get excited about it, partly because Brazil lacks the instruments to actually exert influence in Venezuela. If you look at it today, the two leverages Brazil had in Venezuela for a long time were the National Development Bank, which was an enabler of Chavismo, and Odebrecht, also a massive enabler of Chavismo, and we now know a supporter with a lot of finance for the election of Maduro. Those two instances are now gone. Venezuela didn't pay back the National Development Bank, which was exposed to the tune of 6 billion reais in Venezuela, and Odebrecht has 18 billion reais to get back from Venezuela, and it's not seeing any of the money. So the ability to actually do something is minimal. It was very small before as well. I mean, Bill Clinton, at least on 3 occasions, called Cardoso to say, can you please deliver Chavez? And the answer was no. President Bush tried twice. Condoleezza Rice tried 3 or 4 times. And President Lula did not because he felt he could not. So I don't think Brazil is going to take the lead in any of this. In many respects, it's a shame, of course, because they share a border. It's a dry 2,000-kilometer border. There are about 13,000 Venezuelans who have crossed the border to Brazil, and this is creating strains in the public services in the city of Boa Vista up there. Furthermore, if Venezuela collapses more than it has, if Venezuela becomes anything similar to a narco-state, that's an enormous problem for Brazil, because this is a border Brazil does not control. As you know, Brazil in the last 10 years has become the single largest port of export for South American cocaine, in part as an intended consequence of the success of Plan Colombia, relative success of Plan Colombia. There's been a diversion of trade. The port of Santos and the port of Recife in Brazil are now large cocaine exporters. If Venezuela implodes, that, I think, is the single largest national security problem that Brazil will face. But I don't think there is any awareness of this in government. I don't think government is ready to respond. The Brazilian embassy in Caracas, until about 4 months ago, had 1 ambassador and 1 or 2 DCMs only. Very little ability to move in Caracas. It's now been reinforced. They now have 4 number 2s, and they can do a bit more. But the degree to which Brazil can play a role individually, I very much doubt it. In terms of a coalition of friends of Venezuela, President Lula and President Bush and Fidel all agreed to that in 2002. Mm-hmm. But that was a very different situation. Chavez at the time agreed. The Catholic Church was in full support. I don't think the conditions are there now for this, which is very sad in a way, because of course Brazil should be doing more about it.
Mm-hmm. Just one quick, what about the military is not concerned? If this could be possibly the most serious national security challenge to Brazil. I mean, what about the military?
Well, that's the question I ask myself all the time. I was in Brasilia a few days ago and doing precisely that, going around talking to military officers, asking, have you ever talked to a counterpart in Venezuela? Right. Not one said yes. There's no parallel military-to-military diplomacy, which seems to be so crucial. It's of course the way forward in the sense that whatever happens in Venezuela next, the military are going to be such a key component of the new order that emerges. And given the fact that in the past, when Brazil had to care about Paraguay, when Brazil had to end rivalry with Argentina, when instability ensued in Bolivia, the solution to those problems were military to military, backdoor diplomacy. And
You don't think it exists today?
I don't think it exists today.
Thank you. Let's open it up. I know there are a lot of questions. We could start over there. Why don't we take 2 or 3? Start over there, and then Peter. Take a couple. Is that okay? Yeah. You want something to write on, or no?
Sure. Good morning, Alex Sanchez. I'm a defense analyst. I have a question about political parties in Brazil. I mean, Temer is a member of the PMDB, if I'm not mistaken. How is PMDB going to be affected by Temer's disastrous popularity? Are they going to present a candidate for next year, or are they just going to try to forget about that? And also, my second really quick question would be, how have political parties been affected by Lava Jato, and how will they be affected in the polls next year? I mean, the PMDB, the PT, the PSDB, are they just people are not gonna vote for them because they're angry at them and they're gonna vote for small political parties? We're gonna see like a really broken Congress, or what do you think is gonna happen? Thank you.
Thanks. Peter, want to get the microphone here, Luis? Peter?
Peter Hakem, Inter-American Dialogue.
Gotta get ready for this.
Get ready, Matias. You sort of pointed out that pointed to anger as the big motivating force of the Brazilian population now and as they think about the election as it comes. Yet, that he has raised the question, where are the protests? In other words, 4 years ago, the streets were flooded by people, and today, there's nobody on the streets at all. And, you have Lava Jato, the most popular initiative in Brazil. President and Congress have the lowest ratings in the history of Brazil. They're working very strategically to stop Lava Jato. Nobody's going out to the streets. And I just wonder, I mean, if you would add to anger as a factor, one is the degree of polarization, that in some ways that it's not sort of Brazil coming together around the center right, but people are just very, very polarized. And, to go out on the streets, there's not a common. And secondly is the question of just confusion. I mean, if a person who sort of knows the inside and outside of politics can't identify who the 3 candidates are likely to be for the next president, there must be a degree of confusion just throughout.
Okay, thanks. Why don't we take those, then we'll do another round. Sure. I want to start with those.
So on the issue of political parties, Brazil's got the most fractured legislature, fragmented in the world. It's got, as of now, 26 parties with representation in Congress. But the president, the Brazilian president, whoever that is, Cardoso, Lula, Dilma, Temer, doesn't matter, is a minority president. So, because their parties never get more than 20% of the seats. So in order to govern, any Brazilian president needs to form a massive coalition. And because that's the rule of the game, political parties, with exceptions, with 2 exceptions on the left, one of them being PT, have no clear ideological commitment to anything really. This is not programmatic politics. Very different from the United States. When you ask someone if they're Republican or Democrats, whenever they give you an answer, you immediately associate a host of policies to that ideological preference. That's not the case in Brazil at all. So will PMDB as a party pay an enormous cost because of Temer? I think the answer is no, because PMDB was never about identification with either Temer or a particular programmatic set of policies. But it has had an impact on PT, which does have some degree of ideological commitment. So PT has been very severely hit after Lava Jato. They've lost, I can't remember what the exact figure is. A third? Two-thirds. Two-thirds of the positions it had across the country. We're talking about 5,400 municipalities, thereabouts. 2/3 of those are now gone. So it has paid a cost. One of the things that I think is most bizarre about public debate in Brazil today is the amount of political scientists saying, well, the problem with coalitional presidentialism, it's not coalitional presidentialism, it's the number of parties. Should we reduce the number of parties? Let's not have 26, let's have 5, and then we'll have good governance. Well, let me tell you what, Argentina does coalitional politics, and it's got 4 big parties represented in Congress. Do we call Argentina an example of good governance? Macri or no Macri? So, I'll leave it at that. Peter, why no protest? That's what everyone is asking. And everyone I know who does polls is sitting and waiting for a big explosion any day now. The thing with protests is that you can't see them coming, right? But that said, people are protesting in many ways. If you go online, the amount of people asking for the military to come back is staggering. The amount of people asking for the killing of one or other political figure is staggering. Within PT ranks, the opposition to Lava Jato, the notion that Sergio Moro was trained by the CIA is incredible. I get this question 3 times a week. Is there evidence that the United States trained Moro to keep Brazil ensconced in the third world? All of that. So, you know, the United States is the best example. You did not have massive protests before the rise of Trump. You needn't have the streets occupied by people to know that something fundamentally wrong is going on. That said, we may well see that moving forward. The thing with Lava Jato is every week, you know, turning on the television at 10 p.m. has become such an exciting time. And at the same time, people are tired of scandal after scandal, and they get lost. They just don't know. And because the political system is run by 26 parties, it's very difficult to actually distinguish black from white. One of the dangers is, of course, that enemy will take over, that the Brazilian people will remain detached from whatever solution happens at the elite level, as it happened so many times in the past in Brazil. Mm-hmm. I think there's a real danger. And in a context where checks and balances are not operational, when accountability is not operational, where rent-seeking and corruption are so prevalent, that's really dangerous for democracy. So the sad thing to me is that 30 years after the third wave of democratization, you'll have Cardoso here at the Wilson Center this week. 30 years on, when we look at the future of Latin America, can we say democracy will be the only game in town? I think there's a question mark. I don't mean a military coup or any of that, but, you know, the facade of democracy coexisting with traditional non-democratic practices that have bedeviled Latin America for centuries.
How would you fit Altman if he's elected?
Altman?
Yeah.
Okay, so the best take on Altman is from my friend João de Castro Neves from Eurasia, who famously said about 10 days ago, well, the danger with Altman, of course, is that he is to the Brazilian 2018 election what Hillary Clinton was here. A bland candidate, has been in power for 20, 25 years. Some corruption around him, not massive, even in Lava Jato, but small, involving a brother-in-law. No firm opinion on anything, but firm opinions will develop as we get closer to the election. Utterly unable to mobilize the young, very uninspiring. An establishment figure in an election year that is likely to be an anti-establishment year. So I'm extremely cautious with Altman, and I think his party, the party of the social democracy of Brazil, is making a big mistake. Of course, they no longer represent a vision for social democracy. The Cardoso that speaks this week is not the Cardoso of 1979 and not the Cardoso of 1995. Is a Cardoso that is on the defensive, that is worried that Lava Jato is getting too excited, that will warn you about the dangers of the judicial system, you know, being way too tough, and possibly violating the rule of law and due process, and we need to be careful. If authoritarianism goes up, it's not because the political class is rotten, it's because the judiciary system is not respecting the rules of the game.
It's unchecked, right?
Yes.
Thank you. Why don't we go have another round? Yes, sir, you've been patient. We'll start from the back, and then we'll go.
Hi, Charles Stinger, University of South Carolina. With all of the scrutiny that has been put on illicit finance and corporate funding for political candidates, I assume, maybe you disagree, that it's going to be much harder for the parties and the candidates to get that money coming up in 2018, and even for those companies that are willing to cross that line. In the past, they might have funded 2 or 3 candidates to hedge their bets. That also seems unlikely. So where's the money going to come from next year?
Thank you. Why don't we take a question here up front? Thanks.
Hi, I'm Juliano Basili from Valor Econômico, Brazilian newspaper. Mr. Spektor, do you think that we are going to have a renewed 1989 election next year? I mean an election with more than 10 candidates, and at the end we are going to have like a polarized scenario with somebody like Fernando Collor from the right and Lula for the extreme left. What do you think about this picture?
Okay.
Why don't you take those two?
Okay. So on the issue of campaign finance, until 5 months ago, I would have responded by saying Lava Jato's had this great impact, which is to bring to light the dirt that is systematic in the way Brazilian politics are financed. And now, because the public knows, there's going to be change. But then the Supreme Electoral Court had to judge on the finance for Dilma's campaign. And it was a charade, it was a joke. It was a joke in the face of the public, and I think that's really dangerous for democracy, when the people no longer believe that the watchdog institutions can actually do their job. So my sense is that the formal limitations to finance are not gonna even touch the core dynamics that underpin Brazilian politics. Of course, there's the issue of which businesses are willing to risk their necks in this. Open question, I don't know. We need experiments, experimental political science in Brazil. This is, by the way, if anyone's doing a PhD, master's thesis, this is the time to go to Brazil, right? And study Brazil next year. Because what happens there, it's not just specific to Brazil again. Argentina's undergoing dynamics that are not altogether different. Chile, well, with all the differences, but Chile to a degree, in Central America, Guatemala, these are common themes. It's sort of a new agenda for the future of democracy in the region that has to do with the role of watchdog institutions and their ability to remain autonomous from political power. It's to do with the checks and balances that should be operational in any presidential system that aren't in Brazil, so on and so forth. On the
Frank Fukuyama spoke at the same conference as Joao, and he says, as a political science, this is a great time to study the United States.
Exactly.
Same thing.
Yes, of course. On the issue of the election, well, yes, I think most political analysts like João would agree with that notion that the next election is not going to start polarized. It's going to start very fragmented. We're going to have a dozen candidates. And with a dozen candidates, you don't really know who might make it to the second round. And that's really dangerous because someone, our neo-fascist candidate, Bolsonaro, someone like that with 10 to 13% of the voting intention might make it to the second round, and that makes it really very scary. So yes, I agree with your basic proposition.
Questions? Yes, sir. And then Joao.
Thanks. Peter Meyer with the Congressional Research Service. You briefly touched on political reform and coalition presidentialism. You kind of downplayed the effect that moving to 5 parties from 26 may have. What are your thoughts on the prospects for a political reform being passed? And what sort of political reform do you think is necessary to actually get beyond sort of the linkages between coalition presidency and corruption that you said is endemic to Brazil.
Thanks. João?
Thank you. Well, João Castro Neves from Erasure Group. I would like to look a little bit to Latin America and kind of have your view on what you think Latin America, what are the forces that are going to drive kind of Latin America in the coming years? Because some may say that, you know, you had the United States has had over the past decade, several decades, a lot of an influence how Latin American politics is and economy is run. Others say that more recently China is playing a growing role as well. And internally, you've had over the last 15 years or so, kind of the two major models for the region. One, the Brazilian model, as you highlighted well, that was able to mold or at least manage the region in a way that was beneficial to Brazil, right? Through BNDES, Odebrecht, and other large projects. But you had, on the other side, another model that was the Bolivarian model, so to speak, right? Led by Chavez and then now by Maduro. Both of these kind of models are not there anymore, right? I mean, you have Brazil has no tools to influence whatsoever. And the Bolivarian dream became a nightmare, right? And now it's kind of in the past. So given that, the change to those factors, what does Latin America look like? What's going to be the driving force of kind of molding Latin America, if there is such a thing, where it's going to be just anarchy?
Thanks. You wanted to do one more? Mark, did you have a question? Why don't we do another round? Why don't we take these two and then we'll do a final? Huh? You want to follow up on that? Okay. Mark, wait for the microphone.
João's question in terms of good governance. We saw the what looked like the outbreak of a strong anti-corruption movement in Brazil during the Dilma impeachment, but apparently that was turned into appendages of political factions and so forth. But we've seen some great turnout in Guatemala City against corruption. What's lacking in Latin America, and in particular maybe Brazil, about a civil society focused on anti-corruption? For example, I'm very close to the public sector unions movement in Brazil, and yet they have not adopted the whistleblower protection standard as a spearhead for representing both public sector labor and combating corruption. What's the problem?
Why don't we?
Guys, how do I begin? Okay, on political reform, we are seeing now some degree of reform because the political class knows full well that something has to give. But the way things have been evolving in Brazil now, and João can correct me, is this. They're going to focus on the number of parties, so we may see a reduction in the number of parties, and we may see some limitation to the ability that parties in Brazil now have to create coalitions that are moving at any given time, before the election, during the election, and after the election, making it really very difficult for any incumbent to discipline the coalition. Because disciplining the coalition is so challenging, what ends up happening is that the incumbent purchases the vote of coalition members through legal means like pork and through illegal means like campaign finance and bribes. So if you reduce the ability to have all these shifting coalitions, then perhaps things improve. I don't think they're going to improve. I think we're going to have the same at a slightly smaller scale, perhaps, if that. If you ask me, I think we need to go back, and I'm sorry to sound a bit academic, I won't be.
No, fine.
In 1985, Juan Linz, great Spanish political scientist, looked at Latin America and said, Latin America is making a big mistake. These countries are adopting coalitional presidentialism. This is wrong. This is going to produce a disaster. Why don't you just copy Portugal and Spain, which are also coming out of authoritarianism and high levels of corruption and very bad governance. Poverty levels are awful in both Portugal and Spain. And these countries got it right because these countries connected the fate of the legislators to the fate of government through parliamentarism. If legislators in Spain and in Portugal don't deliver public goods, they fall. If legislators in Brazil or in Argentina or Guatemala or Venezuela don't deliver public goods, they survive. because the electorate only demands public goods from the president, not from Congress. So this country's coalitional presidentialism is great for other stuff. We don't have deadlock. There's no shutdown of government. These countries have not the problems of the United States at all. But they have a host of other problems, which includes rent-seeking and corruption that is endemic, I think. So I'll stop there on that front. João and Mark, your question is so difficult that I'm going to do the trick that is so common in academia. Retreat back to my old, youngish, naive Marxist. What is the future of Latin America? Well, Latin America, we know one thing for a fact, and you don't have to be a Marxist, I'm joking. You have to believe in economics. Latin American political cycles are determined by two factors. International interest rates defined by the Fed and the price of commodities. And we have learned in the last many, many decades, and in particular in the 2000s, that when international interest rates are low and commodity prices are high, the political fortunes of whoever is an incumbent in Latin America goes up. And when the scales invert themselves, interest rates go up, commodity prices go down, the political fortunes of the incumbents go down. In countries like Brazil, like Chile, not the Bolivarian left, both the PT and the Concertación could navigate these waters in ways that were relatively moderate, maintaining some degree of safety nets for the very poor. In places of the Bolivarian ilk, be them Bolivia or Venezuela, you couldn't, or Ecuador. Of course, Bolivia is an exception because commodity prices for Bolivia have not come down. They've kept going up thanks to iPhones and iPads and things. So when we look at the future, I think the answer will be, how do political classes deal with this fundamental fact that no Latin American country has managed to escape and is very unlikely to escape? And that brings us back to the old 1977 Cardozo with dependency theory. Mm-hmm. I didn't want to end on that note, but this is where I am now. On the issue of civil society, Brazil has a vibrant civil society. And again, I think this relates to Peter's question. We shouldn't expect civil societies in Latin America to go out and protest and have the banner of anti-corruption in ways that we don't see elsewhere in the democratic world. Civil society expresses itself through many other means, some of which are anti-democratic, as we see across the board, right? The extreme wings of the Tea Party, that's civil society alive for you. The extreme right in Germany, which now had a ball in this week's election, is an instance of civil society being alive and kicking. And we are seeing the same now in Brazil. Why is there no revolution in the sense that, the people will not tolerate corrupt politicians? I think the answer is Brazil's political system requires corruption to exist. Look, there's not one former president of Brazil in the democratic cycle. That is, Sarney, Collor, Itamar is dead, Cardoso, Lula, and Dilma. Not one of them doesn't have a criminal investigation going on. Not true. Cardoso doesn't because he's above the age of 80. So he cannot be taken to court. Okay? This is endemic. This is not exceptional. And when you have that, what could you expect other than social anomie with regards to corruption? But that coincides with Sergio Moro being a bit of a hero and the people around Lava Jato being a bit of heroes and becoming ever more radicalized as well. And they too, in social media, become political actors, which is what you're going to hear, I'm sure, from Cardoso. Sorry.
Thanks.
That's my interpretation.
You had a question. Why don't we get one quick round, and then this will be the final round. Yes, sir. And then we'll go to Elizar and one over here. And then we'll
like Peter, I'm confused or bewildered by the fact.
Can you tell us your name before, if
I can?
Oh, thank you.
My name is Jack Heller.
Hi, Jack.
Like Peter, I'm a little bit.
You talk up a little bit so people.
Okay, is this better?
It's better. Thank you.
I'm bewildered by another facet of today's situation. It seems to me that every Brazilian I speak with about the politics readily assigns a large part of the difficulty to the fractured party structure, the lack of accountability, the obvious enabling of corruption by the weakness and marketability of every product, of every party. They're all for sale. But yet, that doesn't seem to be part of today's major civil society dialogue. How come this issue hasn't become front and center? Where's the press? Where are the intellectuals? Why isn't something being made of this? Because until it's addressed, the politics, it seems to me, are totally hopeless.
Thanks. Elisa? Yeah, we have you.
Elcio Santana, Georgetown University. I just want to have your feeling about, given the circumstances, what are the reforms that were in the Ponte para o Futuro that are still possible or not in the government of Temer?
Thank you. We had a final question here. This side.
Bernardo Weaver, and my question is a point that was not so much touched, but I think it has to do with civil society. And do you not, there's a fascinating study by the Kennedy School where they correlate geographic distance of the center of power of a given polity to the levels of corruption. One of them, for example, being Albany, right there in the middle of New York State, versus other capitals that would be closer to the population. And whatever system that might be, that is from Rio, where I'm from, 1,300 kilometers away, isn't it the distance of politicians, both mental but also physical, keeping them from being accountable to the people that they govern? And in that way, wouldn't a less federal-centric Brazil, such as a German system or even a United States of the 50s, be something that would generate a lot less corruption? Because if anything, my politician is my neighbor. And just to touch on the protests, if you look at the state of Rio, where the capital used to be, we've seen sieges and basically protests that would not let the state assembly work or the state government work, so they would do whatever they were told to do by the people. Take Kiev as well as another example of that. So just...
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so on the issue of the press, I think, well, Brazilian press, first of all, very vibrant, free, and also at the heart of these of the Lava Jato process, right? So the press has covered it extensively. You open every newspaper, you watch television every day, and that's where the press is doing its job. So investigative journalism is alive and well, I think we can say that. And corruption, in all polls, is up there as one of the chief concerns of the people, alongside safety and security, citizen security. And that's why I think there is a real space for a candidate on the center-right to come promising those two things. That combination is very powerful. In terms of the bridge to the future, the big challenge now before the Temer administration is, of course, pension reform. Extremely difficult to do because so many interest groups have congressional representation, but also the regulatory environment, right? One of the undersides of Brazilian market economy in the last 15 years is the quality of regulatory bodies. We now know regulatory bodies responded to political winds in ways that they shouldn't have. They themselves were involved in a set of shady deals. Reforming that is an enormous challenge. Will Temer be able to deliver? As of now, it looks like yes. He seems to be doing that all right. But then the expert is João, and he'll be able to say more. On the issue of accountability, you're absolutely right. The electoral system now makes it very hard for politicians to be accountable to the people, partly because we have a majority system for president. So presidents in Brazil need 50% plus one of the vote to make it. So they need to deliver goods to 50% plus one of the voters. But Congress is not elected through a majority vote, as in the United States. Congress is voted through a proportional vote in a coalition. So the coalition adds up the number of votes it gets, and it picks and chooses from the list, which means that when you vote for your Congress representative, you don't actually know if you're going to elect that person or someone else. Because you don't know who in the end you elected, you couldn't possibly phone them back and say, where are the promises you made? So the system is flawed to the core. There's very little accountability in the relationship between society and Congress. But also, and crucially, there's very little accountability for presidents too, because the courts, we now know, are politically oriented, because the auditing bodies that should be a check on presidential power do not perform the duties correctly. Because, look at this, President Temer is now responding to charges of, João, help me here, denying obstruction of justice, racketeering, and leading the criminal ring, which is now in power. His two closest associates have been caught on camera with millions of reais in money that no one knows where it comes from. And there he is, he remains. That can only happen in a place where accountability is not operational. So a fundamental feature of Brazilian democracy is very undemocratic. And I think that's my overall message. But my overall message is also that this is not exclusive of Brazil. That 30 years on, we see that this is recurrent across Latin America. The rule of law program at the Inter-American Dialogue is, this is it. We have a problem with the rule of law.
And we're going to solve that, right, Michael?
Exactly.
Yeah, 6 months, 6 months. Come back in 6 months, that'll be solved. Matias, this has indeed been a treat. You've offered a lot of clarity and a lot of light on a confusing and a somewhat dark situation, but we're very, very grateful to you for coming by and sharing your insights. This has been terrific, and please come back. This is your home. You should feel that way, and we love having you here, so thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.